Welcome again to the Forum on Israel-Palestine, Christian Forum on Israel-Palestine. It is a forum that seeks to promote understanding about Israel-Palestine, having conversations with scholars and activists and others affected by the events on the ground. We try to encourage critical thinking, informed engagement with the complexities of the region, and we aim to challenge stereotypes, break down barriers to dialogue, and actually humanize everyone involved to the degree we can. We're hoping to work towards the future for Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others in the land to live in dignity, equality, and justice for all. Today with us, we have the great privilege of having Dr. Rachel Havrelock, who's professor of English and Jewish Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She also directs there the Freshwater Lab, focused on water justice, species survival amidst accelerated climate change. She's a lady of many scholarly talents. Her latest book is what will preoccupy most of our attention today, the Joshua Generation, Israel, Occupation, and the Bible, Princeton book from 2020, tells the story of how the Bible became militarized in the creation of modern Israel, yet still holds lessons for de-escalation and cohabitation. While she wrote her book previous to this book, The River Jordan, Mythology of a Dividing Line, University of Chicago, 2011, Dr. Havelock became involved in environmental peacebuilding with the Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian NGO EcoPeace for the Middle East. She was also the recipient of a 2014 Alumni Impact Award from the U.S. Department of State. Among other notable feats, she co-wrote a hip-hop play from Tel Aviv to Ramallah about the daily lives of young people in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in this conversation, we will explore how early Zionist movements, and particularly how Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, found in the biblical book of Joshua a narrative and a template to give the nation state a unifying identity. So Israel was being tasked to recapitulate the Joshua narrative with modern era Palestinians standing in for the Canaanites and other groups, and thus to share their fate. Rachel, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's jump right in. I really can't help but ask you a little bit of what derailed you from a promising career in hip hop music, beginning the musical you co-wrote, I think, with your husband.
I'm not so sure my own career in hip hop was promising at all, but I had during the Oslo period, I had the privilege to study in Tel Aviv and Ramallah, and to travel back and forth. I was a graduate student, and I got to meet my peers in both places. And on a few such trips, my husband was able to join me. And I was busy dissertating and trying to process what this all meant when that line and that divide had lowered just a little bit. And, I was deep in academics, and Yuri, my husband, was just meeting people, and he's a hip hop performer. And so he was really able each day to kind of play back what he saw and took in and the people we met. And we have another partner in that show, Sharif Izzat, who does live visuals. And so while I was trying to work it all out for academic work, it became like a great creative project that it rolled out a little bit easier because it was focused on people and their daily lives and getting that up on stage instead of having to do the deep dive on every concept and what's its origin and all the variations. This was really focused on a lot of the really generous people that, we got to meet and visit in their homes and, see what they were trying to get going in that moment of certainly now relative hope.
Well, you always have something to fall back on if academia goes bust. in Bear.
Playwriting, right? Very stable, very stable.
I know you studied with Daniel Boyarin, who was a prolific and ambitious and incredible scholar of early Christianity and early Judaism, right into the rabbinic period. Very creative writer. How did those studies set the stage for things you would do later?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I really, so many teachers opened up traditions, scholarly traditions in Hebrew and Aramaic, Greek and Arabic. Really like remarkable chance to have studied with many scholars, and Daniel Boyarin as my advisor, most prominent among them. And I would say, along with his exacting insistence on knowing the languages very, very well and the textual traditions, was really thinking about border lines and why they are thrown up by particular people, particular thinkers, why those lines are thrown up at certain moments. So, among Daniel's great work is really thinking about when those lines, those divides were insisted upon in early Christianity and, what I think we can call early Jewish traditions, right? Like when this task of definition of difference, and much of Daniel's account is like, well, why the insistence on difference? It was because, in late antiquity, I think that a lot of people were dabbling across all these lines and coming up with theologies that were not orthodox in one way or another. Daniel's work has shown us incredible fluidity and connection between early Judaism and early Christianity. And I think I took from him, maybe in a more literal way, because I really am interested in geographies and how these divisions are drawn in our daily lives across cities and states and lands and rivers. But taking Boyarin's methodology, like why the insistence on a border, on a line, on a division in certain places and times. And for me, that's been really geographic and political, as well as pertaining, to when we insist on these lines in our religious lives. Oh, Michael, I think you're muted.
Oh, excuse me. I was just going to wait for Gary to jump in, and I had muted.
No, actually, let me follow on from this. One thing that our listeners may not realize is that Rachel is very much a river person. So she's been following rivers through much of her career so far, and it even includes in Illinois, where she lives. I think you live in Illinois, don't you?
I live in Illinois,
yeah.
probably.
And then the Great Lakes and so on. Yeah. And so, of course, that spills over to the Jordan River, no pun intended. But there we have it. Let me ask you about the Jordan just for a moment more. So in your mind, and rivers take on a mythological value, don't they? And I guess let me just put the ideas out there and you can go with it. The Jordan becomes a mythological idea. And so is it fair to say that before the Zionist period, before Ben-Gurion, we'll say, that the Jordan was less of a mythological idea and there was more fluidity moving back and forth across the Jordan? Was the Jordan up? Did it become a hardened boundary, shall we say, in the imagination of the early Zionists?
Yeah, great question. And I want to always, as we talk about the Jordan as a concept and a mythology and a border, I always like to begin with the fact that the Jordan River, right, holy to over half of humanity, is currently at about 4% of its historic flow. So I always like to begin with, we are obviously doing something very wrong when something that we do hold in common, that is recognized across Islam, Christianity, Judaism as a sacred river
Right.
is so tied to our text that it is, allowed to so diminish and be so polluted such that modern day pilgrims, when they are in the Jordan Valley for a baptism in the summer months, they're in the lower half of the Jordan, they are immersing in runoff from agriculture and industry. So, I kind of think about that as, a baptism into a late industrial age. So, if we kind of come from 2026 and this, river at 3 or 4% of its historic flow, right, that is the index to me of things gone horribly amiss. But to answer your question, so, rivers, among their remarkable properties of sustaining us and life-giving and enlivening our food and our world, they have these incredible properties of being both a connector and a divider, right? A north-south flow obviously, connects source and terminus, water always moving. And there's the division fact, right? One way or another, you have to get yourself across a river. And so in the, especially biblical and post-biblical traditions that I studied, right, that connector divider dimension,
Right.
took on mythological resonance, right? History and the future, the terrestrial world and the divine world, or the world beneath. So, right, this connector or divider and all the spiritual dimensions of that. In the Hebrew Bible, of course, crossing the Jordan River is an act that exerts a tremendous transformation on the individual or the community. And traditions of baptism, of course, right? The rebirth, the immersion, the revivification, also, equally powerful in its imagery. So, okay, then we come to modern times, and when the Jordan Valley was overseen by the Ottoman Empire, there are a lot of stories I came upon of people like swimming across, getting lost, or these migration stories of communities moving from one bank to the other. And this kind of, the Jordan's not a very wide river for those of us in North America. It might get termed a little bit more like a stream than a mighty river that we're used to. But in the late 19th century, British exploration group called the Palestine Exploration Fund. They were digging for biblical antiquities, but also prospecting for oil and drawing up maps for conquest. So the Palestine Exploration Fund, for some contingencies that are funny, we can talk about if desired, but their map ended up designating the Jordan River as a border. And so when the British, led by General Allenby, went into the field in World War I, they went in with that map. And so that map informed British and European imagination that the Jordan River was a border. Now, if you come from a biblically inspired country, biblical texts offer you different routes: the connecting version or the dividing version. The British and the French, the other colonial powers, decided the Jordan River was a political border, and that was going to be the border, of British Mandate Palestine.
So, Rachel, if I can just ask you, so if I were to be living in 1850,
Yeah.
Smack in the Ottoman period, there would not be the same sense of border with the Jordan, but people would be moving back and forth across. And so the economy, say, of Palestine would be the economy of Transjordan.
Yep, exactly right. Yeah, a very incidental, non-marked, pretty much non-guarded border. There were some, tax laws during the Ottoman times, but that really changed. And so here's where it really, really impacted both Jewish and Palestinian nationalism, because if we look at, the run up to the early 1920s and the peace treaties that ended World War I, Jewish nationalists, Arab nationalists, Palestinian nationalists, they had a lot of ideas about where a given land might be, and also what its nature might be. So even, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, he in the 1920s had a lot of ideas about the potential for a country to which Jews might immigrate. And some of them were like, well, it could involve, Baghdad and Jerusalem. It could really be a Jewish Arab federation. But there were a lot of ideas, and the nation state and this was, certainly true for Jewish nationalists, also Palestinian nationalists. The nation state was not the only or even the most desired endpoint. There were a lot of ideas. However, once the British said, this is what the country looks like, and the Jordan is the border, there was a kind of massive adaptation of Jewish national as well as Arab national traditions to kind of assimilate and claim that border, as this kind of central signifier of a nation state.
And it could be confirmed, I guess you could say, through the Joshua story, where the epic entry into the land is Joshua crossing the river. So therefore, even Joshua knew that it was a hard, fixed border in the Zionist imagination.
Absolutely right. So that idea in the Zionist imagination of the Jordan River being this definitive boundary between homeland and exile, the Joshua story really became the language through which that claim of homeland was expressed, to the point where when people immigrated to Israel, made Aliyah, even before the founding of the state, the establishment of the state, they would often call it crossing the Jordan, even if they were coming from Europe and coming, they were really crossing the sea.
Oh, really? That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, so work for a minute. So you've done this work with rivers, Jordan River. I even noticed that you came across that old pipeline for oil that was somehow under the Jordan River. Oh my gosh, lucky you. But then there's the book of the story of Joshua and the tribes. So you've already said that in a way the Jordan River then figures in the the Zionist imagination. How does the book of Joshua then also become a signal player in how the Zionist imagination is formed about this country?
Yeah, the book of Joshua, I would venture, is the most influential biblical book on political Zionism. And there's an irony in that, because in the many centuries of rabbinic Judaism, the book of Joshua was not often read, not often commented upon. In the liturgical cycle, you don't really hit Joshua all that much. And it was also kind of rejected in diasporic Judaism for being kind of incendiary. Like, this is a book about, honestly perpetrating a genocide on native peoples. And it was really seen as anathema to rabbinic Judaism. But the book of Joshua has a few qualities. And one of them is that it's quite geographic, right? It names places, it thinks about geographies, it explains geographies. So when we think about, early political Zionists actually immigrating to this place that was their alleged homeland, they didn't know it. It wasn't very familiar. So on the one hand, Joshua became the prism through which the land was seen in its geographic identity. So many, many place names, right? Many geographic features are wholesale adopted from the book of Joshua. And then there's the other kind of anomalous dimension of political Zionism, because again, back to my advisor, Daniel Boyarin, as his research showed, a kind of militaristic masculinity was also anathema to diasporic Judaism, which was a much more scholastic and cosmopolitan culture. So also, coming to an unfamiliar place in an era of colonialism that sets up a zero-sum game among, aspiring Palestinian nationalists and aspiring Jewish nationalists, right? There's also the sense of like, you're going to have to, militarize here. And the book of Joshua becomes the language for doing that. Yeah. It becomes this kind of like template for masculinity. Literally, the divisions of the army in Joshua were put into place in the Israeli military. And so it becomes like it is adopted, especially the first half of the book, to really provide a template for a whole kind of Judaism that, hadn't existed before. And, this is maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but the tragedy of that, I think, has been, adopting its language, its form, its institutions, its idea about a collective defined by ongoing war. The tragedy of that wholesale adoption is, I think, it has ensnared the Jewish national project in these ongoing cycles of militarism that are only stepped up, every generation, one after another, to things becoming like increasingly violent and divided. And to the point where I think, much of the culture of Israel is in fact getting squeezed out by this commitment to
do you think,
militarism.
Do you think, Rachel, that it's always been that way? Or do you think, every country has an origin story. You're saying that, so the boundaries of this origin story is the Jordan River, et cetera. Then also there's a kind of mythology about what does it mean to be a young Zionist? What does it mean to be the new Jew, as they also said, as they come into this land? So it has a sort of a militant posture. Your relationship with the land is conquest.
Yes.
So do you think, does that very formative idea that comes out of Joshua, is it sustained decade by decade? And I actually wonder if in the last 5 years it has been inflamed even further.
To start with your second question, it has certainly been inflamed even further in the past 5 years. And I think the process that we've also seen is moving from like metaphor, right? Yeah. We are like the Joshua generation.
We are Joshua.
Yes, to a kind of literalism, so that the Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli Minister of Finance, literally bases state policy on the book of Joshua. So it's a move when, I'm getting a bit of an echo. Are other people hearing? Okay. Maybe that was to show the resonance of the point, but right. So when Ben-Gurion really initiates putting the book of Joshua at the center of Israeli culture, which is an instinct that he has during the founding war in 1948, but he really steps up the kind of cultural association with the book of Joshua 10 years later in 1958. And at this point in 1958, for Ben-Gurion and the other elites who joined him, I believe that the book of Joshua offered them a way to talk about what had happened in 48, to talk about ongoing campaigns of Palestinian displacement, but without having to like admit quite, the brutal truth.
Sorry. I just wonder if we can just step back a little bit into the argument of your book itself for a second. and there's several questions I could ask. Let me start here. You find in the people of ancient Israel a loose confederacy, as you describe them, of tribes united around a conquest story, which brings the book together. And I wonder if that template gets played out both in the book of Joshua, but also in the modern state. And you sort of trace that sort of transposition. I wonder if you can say just a few words about that, because I thought that was very interesting.
Sure. Yeah. I think I maybe wouldn't have devoted so much of my life to the book of Joshua if there weren't some kind of like alternative buried within it. And so the book of Joshua really has two defining parts. The first half is this scorched earth conquest story that really describes and revels in what we would call genocide. But the second half of the book, if you keep reading, it gets kind of boring because there are a lot of geographical lists. But if you keep reading, all the same peoples who were allegedly exterminated in the first half of the book,
they show up again,
reappear in the second half. And so really doing a deep dive in those textual traditions together with anthropological methodology. Now, why is that echo?
Maybe if we can all mute unless we're speaking at that time, it might help.
Okay, how is it? Yep, I think it's better. Okay, we have to go on and off. So reading the second half of the book of Joshua and related texts together with anthropological theory, right, we really can see in ancient Israel these different social divisions, right? People associated in terms of a household, in terms of a clan, and in terms of a tribe. So, right, these are these kind of like dispersed identities and affiliations. But as we also know from the ancient world, it also was an age of empire. And a bunch of dispersed clans were not going to hang on to their lands or hang on to their property in that manner. So, you know, we see, and ancient Israel wasn't alone, similar confederations were occurring like across the Jordan River in ancient Moab. So, right, the kind of Assyrian conquest and the like motivated this consolidation. And so there had to be, you know, a kind of a process of bringing families and clans and tribes in, having them affiliate with some kind of centralized government, while also giving them, you know, allowing them some degree of autonomy. So many of the traditions in the Hebrew Bible are these local regional stories, you know, whether that's the Samson group or the Deborah group or the King Saul group, right? These are really local and regional traditions. But, you know, sometimes I give the analogy of like Thanksgiving, right? How people reach the United States, families have different immigration stories, migration stories, but somehow, you know, we're also given a story, also premised on a genocide, we might note. We're given a story that kind of becomes this founding story of our country, which is celebrated in our households, but it's also kind of nationalizing moment. And I see the conquest of Joshua, it's kind of functioning like that Thanksgiving story, as being this celebration of a mythic battle when all of the people who don't affiliate with us, right, who, you know, are outside of our confederation, who remain thorns in our side politically, they're imagined as being exterminated. And all the allies who join this confederation of ancient Israel are enlisted in Joshua's army. So, right, the conquest story, this scorched earth, is really about catalyzing a national identity through an image of the army. Whereas we can go to the second half and say, okay, right, there's not a unified confederation here. There are all kinds of people, right? Families and clans and tribes that are sometimes affiliated, right? Sometimes in tension. And they're living alongside all of these other tribes and peoples in this kind of like ongoing negotiation, not always comfortable. So again, like I see the various, Canaanites and Jebusites and the like who are allegedly exterminated. Those are the groups that don't join the Confederation and are vilified in the book of Joshua. But in fact, those people are never exterminated. They're like your nettlesome neighbors that you don't like, but they're still there. And for me, in as much as Ben-Gurion and other political interpreters kind of shoehorned the state of Israel into this Joshua story, I see this parallel uncomfortable reality, right? For all the insistence, right, that there is absolutely, right, a unified Jewish state of Israel, when we look at the reality on the ground, it simply isn't true. To begin with, right, there are Palestinians and Israelis, they are cohabiting the same land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And the amount of money and bloodshed and military technology to enforce division on what is cohabitation, to me, is this kind of fundamental violence. And anyway, right, if you want to look beneath, the terms Israel and Palestine, there's a patchwork of peoples, right, with different levels of religious observance, right, different religions. You've got secular, religious, everything in between. You've got different ethnicities of people, different languages. It is a patchwork place of, many peoples and, to use our biblical term, many tribes. And so again, I see the exterminations, the violence, right, the ongoing attacks on Palestinian lives and livelihoods is like to force some kind of national reality that does not exist on the ground and quite frankly is never going to.
So in a sense, you could say Joshua also supplies a script so that the modern Israeli knows what to do with the Palestinians. They're Canaanites.
I think it's absolutely right. And we have, in the book of Joshua, this really violent, disturbing biblical book, right? Until today, Jerusalem is divided between the people of Judah and the Jebusites. I mean, we have a biblical precedent for a divided city by two peoples. And right, that biblical verse kind of says, yeah, that is the state of Jerusalem. It's a bifurcated city. And maybe there's like absolutely nothing wrong with that. It becomes like figuring out how to live together.
It's very promising. Bruce, I think you have something here. Sorry, I kind of cornered him there.
And then he's got to find.
No, sorry, I was on mute, and I hope my sound is not interfering with the conversation. But I'm wondering if we could spend a little bit more time on David Ben-Gurion, whom you've done a lot of work on, and put him into this context more explicitly in terms of his fascination, his almost fundamentalist obsession with the Book of Joshua. Give us a little bit of the background of that phenomenon in the early 50s, when he's trying to sort of find a way to form his nation around some kind of collective identity.
Yeah. So Ben-Gurion, again, he loved the book of Joshua. He has a famous quotation in the 1948 war where he says, "No interpreter, Gentile or Jewish, has better interpreted the book of Joshua than the Israel Defense Forces in the war." So the war ends, the 1950s come, and the war ends in many ways. The war has never ended. We're in 2026, and that war is still playing out literally on this very day. So there's ongoing campaigns to dispossess Palestinians at the same time that there is a kind of unbelievable program of immigration and absorption of Jewish people from the corners of the earth, with no common language. Again, obviously common religious practices, but, thousands of years of diaspora, there were different versions of the practice of Judaism. So there's this massive immigration push, and Ben-Gurion looks out approaching the 10th anniversary of the State of Israel, and he doesn't like what he sees. He, does not see a common culture. He sees class divisions. He was a socialist. He, really looked askew at class divisions. He sees class divisions. He sees ethnic divisions among Jews, such that, playing out as they do in North America and Europe, where, right, the darker the people, usually the fewer opportunities and privileges were awaiting them. He doesn't see a common language, and he really wonders, like, what is going to be the catalyst for this feeling of unity at the 10th year. And he also looks out and he realizes that by 1958, most of the Jewish citizens of Israel had not experienced the founding war. And so he decides that everyone, every Israeli needs to feel like they had been there in 1948, right? That they were part of this historic victory. And so he gathers together in 1958, like leading academics and members of the government and military, and they meet twice a month on Friday afternoons, and they begin to parse the book of Joshua. And on the one hand, Ben-Gurion wants to invent a distinctly Israeli mode of biblical interpretation. He doesn't want it to be rabbinic. He doesn't want it to be like historically Jewish. He doesn't quite want it to be like academic biblical studies. Like, he wants this special nationalist kind of interpretation. He kind of fails at that, unless we want to, grant him literalism that so defines religious nationalism and its relationship to the Bible. And so out of this study group, Ben-Gurion and his cohort produces really a mythological rendering of what had happened in 1948, in which there's this kind of secular language of miracle, right? We were delivered from the attack of every Arab country on us, right? We were a fledgling army, with people who had survived the Holocaust and still fought. So it's this language of like impossible miracle. And, as an aside, I sort of came to the book of Joshua because I was raised on that story. And I remember in my classroom, like staring at a map that was like biblical Israel and modern Israel at the same time. And, my own youthful mind processed this of like, oh, it happened 2 times. Right? We were oppressed. We crossed back home. We won the land. God delivered us. Ben-Gurion was not into the God part, but he saw this as a secular miracle of the rebirth of the Jewish people into him, their proper nationalist form. And so 1948 and Israel's founding becomes mythologized in a way, and that becomes the story that is like exported to the world, right? That's the media story. And at the same time, like all mythologies do, right, the gritty reality of that got erased and got sanitized. And that's one more, just like one thing on the sanitized, because, and this is something in my own life, like, no story ever told to me contained Palestine or Palestinians. And so, right, this kind of like rediscovery of an actual place and reclaiming it from the myth was very important to me in my own education. And I feel like the success of Ben-Gurion's story is a real barrier to de-escalation of this conflict and genocide, because the sanitation of it has been so widespread.
Just very quickly, well, I think caught my ear in what you said. Many things were very interesting, but that he's a secular Jew who then latches onto Joshua. I'm wondering if there's a story there, how that happened. He brought around a circle around, as I understand it, some of these were scholars. And then they create, you called it a secular mythology, that today is, I mean, how do you view what Netanyahu when he refers to these things? On one hand, I want to see this secular. On the other hand, Netanyahu is imbuing it with just in faith and fervor. So just that tension point, and then we can move on. But
yeah, we're in a very, we're many generations away from Ben-Gurion with Netanyahu. And, one piece that's kind of important to emphasize with Ben-Gurion is when he issues this mythology in the 50s, kind of is a unifying story for Israelis and for world Jewry, and I would say for like supporters of Israel the world over. That unity starts to fragment in 1967 with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, because different groups of people have different reactions to that. You have a peace movement that is then like done with Joshua, done with biblical justification, denounces these things. But there's also the rise of the settler movement that again kind of goes out into real world geography, with a gun in one pocket and Joshua in the other, so to speak. And they also use it as a justifying text for ongoing quotidian violence and expropriation. So there's like a new literalism that takes off in Israel, in Jewish nationalism, that grasps on to Joshua all the more tightly. So when we have, for example, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, going to the U.S. Congress and, quoting lines from the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, a couple things are going on, right? Netanyahu is again taking hold of biblical verses for political cover and justification among Israelis and Jewish nationalists, but he's also speaking to members of the US Congress that have had a similar trajectory, right, of a kind of an increased literal read of the Bible and imbuing that literalism with politics and militarism. So Netanyahu's playing a little bit of a different game than Ben-Gurion with the same script.
Rachel, you
talked about. Go ahead.
You said that.
I was just going to say you talked a couple of times about literalism as sort of foundational to religious nationalism, and you're talking. You've written about weaponization of scripture. I'm wondering if you could maybe explain to us how you use that term. And later, maybe we could talk about how Joshua maybe is the antidote to that weaponization. But first of all, what does it mean to weaponize the Bible? Is it to treat it literally, or how do you understand it?
Yeah, I think to weaponize the Bible involves, first of all, a kind of a selective reading. And that selective reading means that there's some kind of ideology in which, right, a person or a political figure, right, already thinks they're right, or at least thinks it's politically expedient. So to weaponize the Bible is to separate it from centuries of interpretation. It's to separate it from its historical context. Again, looking at like the ban, the cherem, which, is this instrument of extermination in the book of Joshua, right? We can look at that in an ancient Near Eastern context, right? And we can see how that symbol works and, what it does comparatively. We can think about that ban and how it's been understood and how the violence has been mitigated through centuries of historical interpretation. Or we can think, right, that ban is speaking to us directly, right now in this moment, and that it is compelling some kind of action. And so that action is then taken under cover of that text. And when there is inquiry, right, in the modern day press or, international judiciaries or some kind of moral accounting, right, the verse is cited, right, to justify, to give cover. And I think another part of its weaponization, right, is to silence, right, those voices that say you're misreading, you're misconstruing, and you are acting in an unethical, immoral way. So it's to rip out something only as far as it coheres with a previously existing ideology, rather than to be bound by the ethical traditions that accompany those biblical verses in every religious tradition.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Rachel, if I can just ask you this piece. So I'm moving from Ben-Gurion to the settlers. So you described Ben-Gurion's treatment and use of Joshua as an ideological instrument, really creating a mythology. It's secular, a secular miracle. Those were the words you used. It seems to me in the last 5 years, though, the settler movement now has, of course, like you just said, re-adopted the whole Joshua narrative, and yet with a difference. Because you hear, is this language only for Western consumption? Because you hear settlers saying, God gave us this land. We have a divine mandate. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, it's not just cover through a unifying narrative. It is cover because we have a divine mandate. And therefore you have not just a sort of ethnic nationalism happening with the settlers. Is there a kind of renewal of a spiritual justification, lack of a better word, a religious renewal? So therefore, Joshua is not just a story, it's a divine story.
Mm-hmm. That's
you know right. What I'm trying to do here?
Yeah, I absolutely know what you're trying to do here. And it's a little, what you describe is kind of like the return of Ben-Gurion's repressed, right? Because Ben-Gurion, right, unleashes this mythology, but he's like, no, but we're not doing the God stuff, right? We are the agents of this, right? We're going to not think about that. And, and we're not going to, we're not going to think about the humanity of our opponents. But, to get to your point about the settlers, so it's like what happens after 67, it's like, the very things Ben-Gurion tried to press down, sprout up. And ultimately, right, that is what dooms, right, the labor stronghold, Ben-Gurion's party, Labor Party in Israel. And so ultimately, like, it is this like fragment that happens after the 67 war of peace camps, of settlers, of people who say, what's with this, like, a secular miracle? This is the messianic reality has been unleashed. 67, we made it to the Jordan, right? So 67 unleashes this whole, like, lets a messianic genie out of the bottle, if you will. And, some secular people are like, no, that we're playing with fire, but that becomes embraced in many sectors of the Israeli populace. And it is that messianism combined with the literalism that we've been discussing that undoes the labor government, that ultimately leads to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and leads again to this moment you're alluding to in the past 5 years when it's not only settlers. I mean, settlers are also running the government of the state of Israel. And, in their minds, right, we are living this script and we are going to enact it, right, until we reach that end time. So, this is like Joshua hitting end time politics. And exactly as you alluded to, it's unleashed this kind of like unfettered brutality.
So there's no longer a need for conscience, say, in the bombing of Gaza, the killing of people in the West Bank. because these all can be classified as we are divine instruments.
Yes, and back to the Joshua illusion, it's very disturbing even to utter these words, but right, the language becomes like cleansing, right? Literal, words from the book of Joshua, which, I think we might have forgotten to say this, but, the word for Joshua's conquest in Hebrew is that for occupation. So again, there's a very real sense among settlers, among, and I'd say like right-wing members of the government, which is true, but the government has gone in this direction. The settlers are not fringe. The settlers are running the state of Israel. And so it is this, messianic literalism, this sense of not only are we reenacting Joshua, but we're going to do Joshua one better, because in fact, in the book of Joshua, Gaza remains unconquered, right? Gaza is never conquered. The current governments and heads of army, are almost like even unbound by the biblical precedent at this point.
Rachel, much has happened since 2020. I know you completed the book probably a year or two before that, but I'm wondering if you would write another chapter today in light of what's happened since 2023. What would you add to what you've offered us? There seems to be an intensification that's happened, and an abandonment of any restraint, as you've mentioned. So how would you supplement if you were invited to write a second edition?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I have been working on a piece that I actually call the Joshua State. That among the ways I diagnose what has happened in these past couple of years in Israel-Palestine is that we're no longer talking about a Jewish state, right? The premise of the Jewish state was, if you are ethnically Jewish, or you've had a conversion that the state recognizes as being proper, right? You can immigrate to that country. You can find sanctuary, God forbid, if you need it, right? Premised on this idea of sanctuary for Jewish people after a long history of persecution. I do not think that is the working premise of the current state of Israel. I think the Joshua State, it means, are you an affiliate of ethnic cleansing, of intense militarism, of expropriation that has these dramatic bursts of mass killings, as well as like a daily grind of attacks on Palestinian people and their homes and properties. And I even see the international supporters of the state as no longer falling, primarily along a line of is one ethnically or religiously Jewish, but instead, right, how, does one feel about intensive ongoing surveillance, militarism, and violence? So I think that, I would follow it up by saying, right, it's the Joshua narrative that wins. It's not Ben-Gurion's version of it, right? It's very much a brutal, a literal, an absolutist, an unrelentingly violent version of it. And I think, we can see beyond the particular case about like what gets unleashed in these national mythologies, and like, how hard it is to walk it back. And the recapitulation of these fundamental divides, again and again. So I would, follow it up. I think it would be an even sadder and more pensive book, but I would still insist, on a very real bottom line. For all the genocides and all the wiping out of Gaza and flattening of towns in the West Bank, no one's going away. What is going away is the available water that people can access at an affordable rate, and that the challenge right now in that state and others is to figure out, right, how to coexist with our dwindling resources instead of, kind of accelerating a demise through ongoing bombing and mass murder.
Rachel, is a corollary of the Joshua state, as you call it, that if it's no longer a Jewish state, but it's a Joshua state, does that mean that a liberal Israeli who is highly critical of the Joshua project is not a real Israeli?
I think
Perhaps doesn't belong in Israel. And
I think we saw that. I think we
Yeah.
see that, especially with the change to the judiciary a few summers ago. I mean, when you saw, Jewish Israelis who have served in the army and, made their sacrifices, when you saw them being beaten up and hosed down, I think you saw exactly that rise of the Joshua state.
Yeah, you could argue that's not just in Israel that we're seeing what is a true American, what is in other places. There are other similar narratives in Russia around the time of the Ukraine. You're not a real Russian if you do not go the violent side. Rachel, we have learned from you, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish we could go on for 3 more hours, but that might be inconvenient, and no one will watch it that long anyhow. Rob, I don't know if you can pull up her book cover again. I'd encourage listeners to pick up The Joshua Generation, published by Princeton. It's absolutely worth your time. And shameless self-promotion of my employer, Rachel, if you ever write a book called The Joshua State, I would roll out 5 or 6 red carpets to get it and get it to market and promote it. I think that's a terrific idea. Whether that's just going to be an article or something else is my plug. I would read that book, and I know many others would as well. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you all. It really is wonderful to be in conversation about these hard topics. And I think right back to the antidote, it is for us to stay together and talk over these lines. Like this is the formulation of those next narratives that I think we all need so desperately right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you again.